focus, though, right now is on Georgia, where one of the most shameless and vulgar displays of voter suppression is going on in that state. Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate, is running against Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate and the current Secretary of State. In Georgia, the Secretary of State controls the voter rolls, and Kemp has been doing everything he can to keep potential Abrams supporters from voting. A new poll out this morning from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has Kemp and Abrams locked in a very tight race. Kemp is at 47.7% to Abrams 46.3%. That is well within the margin of error and is insignificant when you look at the stats. Now, in effect, they are tied, which is why of 53,000 voters whose registrations are currently pending, 70% of which are African Americans, is so important. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the Georgia NAACP have both filed lawsuits to stop this latest attempt to steal the election by Republicans in Georgia. Now, 53,000 people whose registrations are pending fail the exact match test, where missing just an apostrophe in your name, for example, will disqualify you from registering. Stacey Abrams joins us right now live from Georgia. Stacey, glad to have you here. You serve in the state legislature, and what I'm trying to understand is why folks have not asked Brian Kemp to recuse himself, but so to have the person who is Secretary of State making these decisions when he is the gubernatorial candidate, that to me sounds unfair.
I agree. It is very concerning to me. And in fact, our Constitution in Georgia does permit the Secretary of State to continue in that job until the end of his term. But in previous years, Democratic and Republican secretaries of state have looked at this very closely. Secretary of State Karen Handel stepped down from her job. Secretary of State Kathy Cox considered it, but she didn't win the primary. Max Cleland stepped down. And so we know that prior secretaries of state of both parties raised grave concerns about overseeing your own election to the highest job. Unfortunately, Brian Kemp does not care. Even as the Democratic leader in the House, I stepped down from my job in the legislature because I wanted there to be no appearance of impropriety. And I'm deeply dismayed that he would put his own ambitions ahead of the integrity of our election process. But here's the thing. It's up to him to decide. There is no legislative imprimatur that can make him leave. It's up to his conscience and his goodwill. And I think we see from his behavior that he does not believe it's necessary to step down.
Well, what is stunning to me is when you begin to look at what's going on here, to say that, well, if you don't put your middle initial or you don't have an apostrophe or a period, they're going to kick those registrations out. That to me is just utterly shameful.
So the exact match system has been in place for years. And if you recall, because you were such a big proponent of ours during this process, when the New Georgia Project filed thousands of registrations in 2014, we raised the alarm that 40,000 were not being processed. 18,000 were processed after the election, but that still left entirely too many unaccounted for. And we started talking to other organizations. We realized that because of how many registrations we'd submitted, that there was something very fishy going on. It took us 3 years in court, but in 2017, we got a court order by a federal court that forced Brian Kemp to admit that he had illegally canceled 33,000 plus registrations for exact match. And the court made him restore every single one and make them voters. And in response to that victory, in response to Brian Kemp admitting he was wrong, the Republican legislature passed a law making it legal for him to do it again. And so we weren't surprised by the number that was released this week because of the AP, because of the Associated Press's investigation. We didn't start this. The Associated Press did this on their own. But we weren't surprised because he's been planning this. He's been working at this, and he does not respect the right to vote for every American.
And again, what we are seeing, this is not just in Georgia. We saw the Missouri Secretary of State, a Republican, actually run commercials telling people they had to use their vote, have an identification to vote. A federal judge came out and said, not the case. We've seen what is taking place in multiple states, and this is state after state after state, where Republicans continue to try to shade the numbers off. And the Republican National Committee, Chairman McDaniel says nothing. Donald Trump says nothing. And significant numbers of Black Republicans say nothing. This is flat out policy of the Republican National Committee across this nation to suppress the vote, to keep people, especially African Americans, from voting.
Well, I would point out that also in North Dakota, they passed a law that in the Supreme Court, with Kavanaugh as the deciding vote, upheld a law that's going to force Native Americans, who've already been stripped of so many rights and so many opportunities. This will disenfranchise thousands of Native Americans because they have a close Senate election there. I, as a daughter of two civil rights activists who fought for the right to vote before they were old enough to vote themselves, I was raised to revere the right to vote. But I was also raised that you fight for that right. And what I want people to understand is we are going to fight for the 53,000 who have not been granted full processing of their application. But I want them to know two things. One, if you're one of the 53,000, show up anyway. Do not let him scare you out of voting. But number two, we have 1.9 million eligible Democratic-leaning voters in the state of Georgia who didn't vote in the last midterm election. If even a fraction of them turn out, especially to vote for the 53,000, we will win this election. That's why they're so terrified. Ayanna Pressley was down here a couple of days ago, and she talked about her election, how she was down 13 the day of the election, but won by 17 points, became the first person of color to go to the House of Representatives from Massachusetts. And what she said is, look, when they do polls, they are polling likely voters. We've got to poll unlikely voters. We've got to turn out unlikely voters. Because what she said is this: you cannot poll transformation. And what we're doing in this election here, down in Florida, up in Maryland, across this country, is transforming the electorate. And we cannot let Republican voter suppression tactics block our way.
Last question for you. I know you have to go. Obviously, lawsuits are being filed. What are you telling people they should be doing? Let's just say that this is potentially their name. First of all, how do they even check to know? I mean, is the Secretary of State, is he notifying people that he's holding their registration, or is there any way for them to even know this?
So part of the challenge with the Secretary of State's office that we identified in 14 is that they have a very haphazard delivery system of information. It's often left to each county or to the Secretary of State, and it can differ. And so we don't know if people know. What we do know is this: if they go to the Secretary of State's website, they can put in their information on the My Voter page and see if their name comes up. If it does not, I encourage them to call the Secretary of State's office and ask about their application. But here's what the Secretary of State has said publicly. He has said if people are on that list, if they're worried about whether they can vote, they need to come to the polling places, bring their IDs, and they should be allowed to vote if they can substantially prove that they are who they say they are. I think that's an entirely unnecessary hurdle because of someone else's mistake, but we'll keep fighting that fight. No one should stay home because they're afraid, because that's how voter suppression works. It's not just about stopping you from registering. It's about scaring you out of using your power. And so everyone who is registered should show up at the polls, make them send you home. Do not stay home on your own.
All right, then. Stacey Abrams, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. We're going to be keeping the focus on this every single day until the election, because I don't care how anybody votes, whether they want to vote for you or vote for Brian Kemp. At the end of the day, it is wrong to suppress the vote. We should be making it easier for folks to vote and not making it harder. Thanks for joining us on Roland Martin Unfiltered.
Thank you so much.